The air was thick, heavy with salt and secrets. It was April 17th, 1961. On a dark, swampy beach in southern Cuba, the world was about to change. A force of 1,400 men, Cuban exiles, were about to step into a nightmare. They believed they were liberators. They thought America had their backs. But in the dangerous game of survival, you must never assume. Assumptions get you killed. These men were walking into a trap, a perfectly laid snare, and Fidel Castro was waiting. The mission had a name, Operation Zapata, a name whispered in the hushed corridors of the CIA. It was born in the shadows, a plan to topple a new king. Fidel Castro had aligned himself with America's greatest enemy, the Soviet Union, a communist outpost just 90 miles from American shores. This was unacceptable, a threat that had to be neutralized. The CIA believed they had the answer. A quick surgical strike, arm the exiles, land them on a remote beach, and watch the Cuban people rise up in support. It sounded simple, deceptively simple. John F. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and untested. He had stepped into the White House with the world on his shoulders. The Bay of Pigs plan was already in motion, a boulder rolling downhill. But doubt had taken root in Kennedy's mind. He was caught between his advisors, who pushed for action, and his own instincts, which screamed caution. So at the last possible moment, he canceled the second airstrike. It was a fatal decision. The invasion started badly. The landing ships hit coral reefs that were not on the maps. Some ships were damaged and could not reach the shore. The plan to surprise the defenders did not work. The Cuban forces were ready and waiting. The attackers lost their advantage right away. Cuban planes, which were supposed to be destroyed before the attack, appeared in the sky. The pilots attacked the ships quickly and accurately. Several ships were hit and could not help the men on the beach. The invading force was trapped. The invaders hoped that the Cuban people would join them and start an uprising. But that did not happen. Castro's government had already arrested many people who might have helped. The invaders were left alone with no support. Fidel Castro was no fool. He was a survivor, a master of his own terrain, forged in the crucible of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. He understood the land, the people, and the art of unconventional warfare. When the first fragmented reports of an invasion crackled over the radio in the pre-dawn hours of April 17th, he reacted with lightning speed. He didn't hesitate or delegate from a distant command bunker. Instead, Castro personally took charge, racing towards the front lines near the Zapata swamp. His voice, broadcast across the island, was a rallying cry. "To the battle!" he declared. "We will destroy the mercenaries!" The Cuban response was a symphony of coordinated, overwhelming force. Castro's strategy was simple and brutal. Throw everything at the invaders before they could establish a secure beachhead. His personal presence electrified his troops. The Revolutionary Armed Forces, once a ragtag group of rebels, were now a formidable army. Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks rolled towards the beach, their cannons blasting away. Artillery batteries unleashed a relentless barrage, shaking the very ground. Crucially, Castro's tiny but determined air force seized control of the skies. Piloting aging warplanes with ferocious courage, they targeted the invaders' most critical vulnerability, their supply ships. The Rio Escondido, carrying most of the brigade's ammunition, was sunk, its black smoke a funeral pyre for the invasion. With their lifeline to the sea severed, the invaders were isolated, their fate all but sealed. On the ground, the fighting was savage. For every Cuban soldier they took down, 10 more seemed to take his place. The swampy terrain the CIA had thought would protect the brigade's flanks instead became a trap, channeling them into kill zones. After just 3 days of brutal, non-stop fighting, it was over. The brigade had run out of ammunition. Their radios crackled with desperate, unanswered pleas for the promised American air support. They were exhausted, defeated, and utterly abandoned. Over 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 were captured. For Castro, this was more than a military victory. It was a political and propaganda masterclass. He had faced down the mighty United States and won. The captured brigade members were paraded on national television, a living symbol of American failure. Castro personally interrogated them in televised spectacles, using the platform to denounce American imperialism and solidify his image as the defiant David to the American Goliath. The Bay of Pigs, intended to topple his regime, had instead made him an icon. The immediate aftermath was a media firestorm. The world press had a field day as headlines screamed across the globe, "Invasion crushed," "Kennedy's fiasco," "America humiliated." The carefully constructed veil of secrecy, which the CIA had tried so desperately to maintain, was not just lifted, it was violently torn to shreds. Every detail of the botched operation was now public knowledge. For the young Kennedy administration, it was a catastrophic failure played out on the world stage for all to see. The diplomatic fallout was just as brutal. At the United Nations, the Soviet Union seized the opportunity to publicly excoriate the United States. Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin thundered against American aggression, painting the U.S. as an imperialist bully. Caught in the crossfire was American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. He had been deliberately misled by his own government, initially denying any U.S. involvement. Now the evidence was undeniable. Stevenson, a man of great integrity, was made to look like a fool. The concept of plausible deniability had evaporated, leaving only humiliation. America's moral authority, a key weapon in the Cold War, was left in tatters, but the most dangerous consequence was brewing in Moscow. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was watching closely. He saw the Bay of Pigs not just as a military blunder, but as a failure of nerve. In his eyes, John F. Kennedy was young, inexperienced, and most importantly, indecisive. Khrushchev believed he had found a leader who could be bullied, a man who would back down when pushed. This dangerous perception was solidified when the two leaders met in Vienna just weeks later. For Fidel Castro, the failed invasion confirmed his deepest fears and led him to seek protection from Moscow. This created the perfect storm. The result was a secret agreement to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Bay of Pigs fiasco didn't just embarrass the United States. It directly paved the way for the Cuban Missile Crisis, pushing the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation. For the men of Brigade 2506, the ordeal was far from over. They were held in Cuban prisons for nearly 2 years. Castro used them as bargaining chips, demanding $53 million worth of supplies for their freedom. On Christmas Eve, the first plane load of freed men arrived in Miami. It was an emotional reunion, but there was also deep bitterness. They had been promised a hero's welcome in a free Havana. Instead, they returned as defeated soldiers, ransomed from a prison cell. The Bay of Pigs was more than just a failed mission. For President John F. Kennedy, it was a searing personal humiliation. It was a brutal wake-up call for a young administration, exposing its naivete on the world stage. The failure forced a profound change in Kennedy's leadership style, transforming him into a far more cautious and skeptical commander-in-chief. This painful education would prove vital just 18 months later. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, the world held its breath. Soviet nuclear missiles were in Cuba, aimed directly at the United States. The stakes were no longer a regional uprising, but global annihilation. Inside the White House, the pressure from his military advisors was immense. Generals like Curtis LeMay argued for immediate, overwhelming force, a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy remembered the bad advice and the unchecked overconfidence that had led to disaster at Playa Girón. He remembered the CIA's false assurances and the military's flawed plans. This time, he would not be rushed. He created a special group of advisors, the Executive Committee, or EXCOM, and deliberately fostered an environment of intense debate, not easy consensus. The lessons of that failed invasion, the memory of the men abandoned on the beaches, directly informed his refusal to launch a preemptive strike. Instead, he chose a naval quarantine, a move that was both firm and flexible, buying precious time for diplomacy. In the end, that caution, born from the ashes of the Bay of Pigs, may have saved the world from nuclear war. But the story doesn't end with the Cold War. The echoes of that battle still resonate today. For Cuba, the failed invasion was a gift to Fidel Castro. It allowed him to rally the Cuban people against American aggression and consolidate his power. The threat from the North pushed him irrevocably into the arms of the Soviet Union, cementing a communist outpost just 90 miles from American shores. The very outcome the invasion was meant to prevent, it instead guaranteed. For the United States, the Bay of Pigs became a cautionary tale, a symbol of imperial overreach. It damaged American credibility and sowed the seeds of what would later be called the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep-seated public distrust of foreign military interventions. The central question it raised remains agonizingly relevant. How much should America get involved in the affairs of other nations? When is it right to act, and when is it better to hold back? From Southeast Asia to the Middle East, policymakers have grappled with the ghost of this failed operation. Beyond the geopolitical chess match, there is the raw, human cost. The Bay of Pigs stands as a permanent reminder that good intentions are not enough. It shows what happens when powerful people make plans that send brave men to die on distant shores. For the 1,400 members of Brigade 2506, the failure was not an abstract policy lesson. It was a nightmare of blood, capture, and betrayal. Over 100 were killed in action. More than 1,100 were captured and subjected to show trials by Castro's regime. Their fate hung in the balance for nearly 2 years. A guilt-ridden Kennedy administration, working through intermediaries like lawyer James B. Donovan, negotiated their release. The final price was not paid in dollars, but in over $50 million worth of baby food and medicine. The return of the surviving brigade members in December 1962 was a somber reunion, a quiet postscript to a national disgrace. The ghosts of Brigade 2506 still haunt the swamps of Playa Girón. Their memory lives on at the Bay of Pigs Memorial in Miami. It is a timeless warning to all who would gamble with the lives of others. The story teaches us that hubris is the ultimate enemy. You must always be prepared. You must always respect the risks, or the jungle in all its forms will swallow you whole.